All right. So, good morning, afternoon, or evening, or other time on Earth. Uh, I'm Kenny, and I'm going to be talking about um, how to academia when your brain can't even, or mental health in grad school. So before I get started, I just want to note that there's a bunch of really heavy stuff in this talk. It is significantly less light in terms of content than probably the vast majority of other things that you'll see at ICFP. Specifically, there's stuff in here about specifics of the experience of mental illness and discussion of chronic disability. I'll briefly mention suicide. I'm not going to go into detail about it. And also some new things since I last started talking about this stuff. The current global pandemic, police violence, structural racism. These things are really hard to talk about. And I want to just say up front that there's going to be some of that in here. If you're having a hard time, you are 100% allowed to zone out and check Twitter. Unlike in a physical conference, nobody can see you looking at your phone, so you can do that as discreetly as you like. You can leave the virtual room, you can go call a friend, you can do anything you need to take care of yourself. I get that this stuff is heavy. I also think that it's incredibly important. But your personal psychological safety and health comes first. Nobody is expecting you to tough it out. And I also want to note that my inbox is permanently open to you, all of you, anyone who's watching this talk, whether you're watching it live, whether you're watching it recorded, whether you're reading these slides at some future point in time, to you and anyone else that you'd like to pass it along to, now and anytime. I want to be a resource to this community to talk about these issues. So I've put my email address on the bottom right of most of the slides in this deck. So if you have personal questions or thoughts that you want to forward to me, I'm here. And without further ado, it's not a particular given time that is universally true for everybody who's listening to this presentation. But for me, it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I am in Philadelphia. So a little bit of background about me. I was born and raised in Natick, Massachusetts, which you can see in this little map on the left-hand side. I went to undergrad at Brandeis University, where I did a bunch of like functional programming and like fun, like beginning to grow into myself as a PL researcher stuff. And then went to University of Pennsylvania, where I did 3 years of a PhD, ended up finishing with a master's instead of completing the PhD. I'll talk about that a lot more later in the talk. And I'm now working in industry as a software engineer researcher at Galois, like Talia said. So in previous iterations of this talk, the last bullet point said like, hello, location where you are. But I think today I say, hello world. Somewhere within this picture, there's a dot of electricity and internet access that represents you listening to this talk. And I think that's pretty cool. I mean, there's a lot of downsides to the virtuality thing. I really miss being around people. I think that's something that, speaking of mental health, really feeds my ability to like feel grounded as a person. But I also think it's really amazing that we have so many people who can attend this virtual conference who otherwise perhaps would not have been able to. So hi, welcome. So that's space, right? What about time? I want to talk about a timeline of important events to me. And I want to start with a very important event. In May of 1993, I was born. And then I'm going to put another dot on the timeline. In August of 2020, I'm here. And in between May of 1993 and August of 2020, a few different things happened. Probably you remember some of them. But the one in particular that I want to focus on is what happened to me specifically, because this talk is quite a lot of it actually about my life, but I hope to generalize quite a bit, in Seattle in August of 2016. So what happened then? In Seattle of August 2016, I was an intern at the Programming Languages Research Group at Microsoft Research in Redmond. I did a lot of hiking and cycling and hanging out with cool nerds. And in between, I did some PL research. And if you look at the picture montage that I put here together, you can see that there are some nice like natural deduction diagrams sketched out on paper. So you can like compare to to David's talk earlier, to note that yes, I was actually doing some PL research as opposed to just staring out at the beautiful pines and riding my bike around Redmond. But there was a lot of that as well. Seattle is really awesome. Microsoft Research is a really fantastic place to be an intern. I should have been having the absolute time of my life. And in some ways, I really was. But at the same time, increasingly, I couldn't fall asleep one day, and I couldn't wake up the next day. I was ravenously hungry 1 hour, and I couldn't eat the next hour. I was like outgoing and social and extroverted and spending all this time with all of my fellow interns one week. And then the next week, I just wanted to be completely left alone forever. And this just started to accelerate to the extent that it was impacting my productivity, it was impacting my social life, it was impacting my just general life happiness and satisfaction. Oh, man. And then one day, on a particularly hungry and disoriented evening when I was particularly lacking in the ability to even do anything, I decided, all right, well, I need to make dinner for myself. So I went to the grocery store and I got this. This is actually a cropped image of the exact thing that I bought at the grocery store, this Signature Select Mexican style lasagna. And I was like, starving, and I promise this is relevant, I absolutely needed to eat dinner. And so I put the lasagna in the oven, and only then I realized that it was going to take 45 minutes for my dinner to even come into existence, because the thing comes packaged as this giant block of lasagna ice, and you have to defrost the lasagna ice before it even starts to become something that is resembling food. It did not end up coming out looking like the package. And then just as I was pulling it out of the oven, this is actual documentation, not a reconstruction, it spilled and slopped over the floor. And in ordinary circumstances, to somebody who is experiencing perhaps more ordinary experiences of mental health, this would have been a minor setback in my evening. But I think I spent the next hour or so curled up on the floor crying, because it felt like this was the culmination of my just ineffectuality at being able to function in the world. And also I was like severely low blood sugar probably. But it just felt like there was this tidal wave of like inability to function that had come over me. So I went to the doctor, and I was lucky enough that my health insurance through the PhD program did cover a local doctor in Seattle. And I was thinking, maybe I have diabetes. Maybe this is like a blood sugar issue that I'm experiencing that's causing all these wild mood swings. And so the doctor did some really quick tests. My pancreas was really excellent. My thyroid was okay, which I guess is okay. Which sort of left only a couple of different possibilities for the symptoms that I was experiencing. And the doctor turned to me and he said, can I bring in my med student? Because I would really like her, she's in her 3rd year, I'd really like her to get a chance to talk to somebody who's an absolute textbook example of bipolar disorder. So I sort of sat there and I was like, okay, I'm thrilled to help educate a new doctor, right? And I mean, like, it was kind of maybe a risky thing for him to ask, because in that moment, he didn't necessarily know how I was going to react to it. But of course, you know, I'm excited about like furthering science and medicine and whatnot. So I was like, fantastic, I will brave forward into this unknown world of having this condition. So before I started giving these talks, I spoke a lot about mental illness in general. But the reason that I'm talking about me, the reason I'm telling this like silly anecdote about me in specifics, is because so that you can understand the background to this talk. Because I think that it's important to situate in specifics, because within that context, there's this problem. people don't talk about mental health. And they don't talk about mental health specifically about individuals. I think there's a lot of generalizing that happens, but I think there's a lot of fear and stigma about speaking about mental health, frankly, as it applies to the particular people who experience mental illness, like me. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit more about me, and then I'm going to generalize and talk about some possible solutions to some of these problems of stigma and harm. Some of them novel, some of them synthesized, some of them, almost all of them, like all good research, derived from prior work. So in any case, I want to talk a little bit more about what happened next to me before we talk about what happens to mental illnesses in general in academia and beyond. So I want to say, first of all, that the response that I got from Microsoft Research and from my research group and from many, many other people was incredibly understanding. I was very, very lucky. My mentor at MSR, Rustin Leno, was incredibly understanding. He said to me, look, you know, this is a life-changing thing that's happening to you. Let's get the work done that we can get done. Let's do some neat research and we'll see what happens. But don't put the pressure on yourself to do something that you might not be able to do given the health situation you're experiencing. And so I ended up being able to finish out the summer doing some really interesting research at my own pace, which was slower than the pace that I might have wanted to work at. So I'm very thankful to Rustin. I'm thankful to my advisor at Penn, Stephanie Wyrick, who was instrumental in helping me navigate this once I got back. Yeah, so a lot of gratitude all around, and to the community at large, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But after that, 3 years of talk therapy, I went through a long journey to find a balance of different psychiatric medications that would help me manage the physical symptoms of this disorder that I have. And you might think, oh, well, you know, the story goes that somebody's diagnosed with such a major mental illness and they drop out of the PhD program immediately. Because of course I've said that I didn't finish the PhD, but that's not actually what happened. I did 2 more years of the PhD program at Penn. I wrote 3 more papers and gave 3 talks. I did enough coursework to get a sort of along the way master's degree. Thank you, Penn, for being a really wonderful place to be along that whole journey. And then at that point, for a bunch of different reasons, I decided I wanted to do a 1-year trial run in industry at Galois to see whether maybe that was a better fit for me than academia. And I decided to stay instead of returning. So here I am. I want to say about psychiatric medication, there's a lot of stigma about it. I'm not a doctor. I'm not here to convince you that drugs are the answer, but I want to just note this here on this slide in particular, because I think that it's incredibly important that we just talk about all of the possible solutions and approaches that can help towards people experiencing mental illness, rather than just saying, oh, well, you know, if you get some therapy, then maybe you're just going to be fine. Because ultimately, sometimes therapy is definitely not enough. It wasn't for me. Man. So, as I've said, the academic PL community has been a dear home to me for 8 years now, 9 years now, something like that. And it's hard to imagine my life without it. But I left my PhD program without a PhD. Why? So, I love the people, I love the research, I love the city. What did I do? What was going on there? For me in particular, it was a lot about structure and balance. The structure of working in an industry setting, working towards more concretely defined goals with a sort of tighter bound on the projects that I was working on, provided a lot of handholds for me that felt like it was a lot more natural for my brain to grab onto. There was a lot more ability to structure my own life to achieve the kinds of work-life balance that I wanted, and to avoid the sort of crunch and stretch of instantaneous panic about a deadline followed by a lot of unstructured time when I didn't necessarily have a lot of external accountability. And I also wanted to be able to choose my life path more actively. I realized that I didn't necessarily want a traditional academic career, and I wanted to be able to see where things took me and explore the options that would make me feel comfortable and fulfilled. A thing I really advise is that if you are thinking about leaving without a PhD, it's a really good idea to try to get a master's degree. Usually this is relatively easy to do along the way, and it's a really valuable piece of paper to have. It is unfortunate that the world works this way, but it is a really good thing to see if you can have the option of getting the extra piece of paper on your way out if you decide to leave. I'm not telling you to leave. And indeed, if I could do it all again, I absolutely would. There's nothing about this path that says to me that I did anything wrong at any given piece of time. It's just the option was the right one at the time that I took it. So I want to stress, like, doing a PhD is awesome and rewarding and extremely worthwhile when it's the right thing. And for a lot of you, it totally, totally is. But I also want to say that there are as many paths through academia as there are people in it, and that's good. And importantly, no matter what path I took, I still have this community. I'm still here. I've been out of Penn for almost 3 years now, and I'm still here. I'm at ICFP, virtually at least. I'm talking to all of you, and that's wonderful to me. So why mental health at PLMW specifically? Well, as I've been talking about, a lot of people like me live with mental illnesses. There's some statistics that I've thrown up on the slide here, right? It's not just because I like talking about myself. A lot of people live with mental illnesses, which means that it's very likely, even more likely than at any previous PLMW that I've attended, that a lot of folks in this big virtual Zoom room are living with mental illnesses. Many of them don't even know it. Some of them do. There's a diversity of neurological experiences and life experiences that exist within our community. And this is also important because we're a community, and a community is made of whole people. And I believe that we need to nurture that community directly in order to have it. But this topic is particularly relevant here in academia because these statistics for this particular biased sample that I'm talking to today, and probably realistically in the future when people watch the recording of this talk, is a massive underestimate of the number of people who have mental illnesses amongst the population who are listening to this talk, because it's actually a lot worse. So I want to read this aloud because when I first heard these statistics, which was a while ago, I was pretty dumbfounded. A 2015 study at UC Berkeley found that 47% of graduate students suffer from depression, following a previous 2005 study that showed 10% had contemplated suicide. A 2003 Australian study found that the rate of mental illness in academic staff was 3 to 4 times higher than in the general population. And the percentage of academics with mental illness in the UK has been estimated at 53%. Everywhere you go, you find replications of these statistics, that these astounding numbers are just replicated over and over and over again, that academics suffer from mental illness far more than the general population. There's a lot of questions about why that might be, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And they continue to be replicated. So like since the last time I gave this talk, there's been a new study in Nature which confirms these statistics yet again. So, you know, sometimes math is not fun. Math is fun a lot of the time. I don't find this math to be particularly enjoyable. So calculating, right? If 47% is the rate of depression in graduate students and 7% is the rate of depression in the general population, which it is, according to the stats that I put on the last slide, then graduate students are more than 6 times more likely than the general population to be depressed. And because a lot of these mental illnesses don't manifest until you're in your early 20s, precisely when many of you will be entering grad school, many don't get diagnosed at all until about now. So those are some correlations, right? I suggest some possible causations. Could it be that grad school causes mental illness? Could it be that people who are predisposed to have mental illnesses might be more likely to attend grad school? Could it be that some shared causes mean that people are more likely to be predisposed to mental illness, and also more likely to attend grad school? I think it's probably a bit of all three, but I want to focus specifically on this implication, the ways in which grad school can impact people's experience of mental illness, and talk a little bit about how it functions. So in the PhD program, there's a particularly high accountability latency. That is to say that the difference in time between when you actually need to be doing the work in order to achieve an impact and when you're actually held accountable for that work are really separated from one another by a long period of time and a lot of potential sort of chains of consequences. You're also implicitly rewarded for heroism, and I put this in scare quotes because I don't think that that such heroism is always very heroic during high-stress crunch times. That is to say, staying up all night, multiple nights in a row to finish that POPL paper just in time for the deadline, etc., etc. Whether or not I want to say about that, whether or not explicitly your research group says that this is a good thing, there's a lot of implicit reward in the system for participating in that kind of behavior. It's also really difficult to know when you're allowed to stop work, when your goals are so self-determined, at least in part. Your research direction is determined by you. The number of papers that you publish isn't fixed as a bar that you absolutely need to cross, or else you know that you're doing it wrong. There's a lot of flexibility, and there's power in that flexibility, but it can also be totally paralyzing. And then, of course, there's financial stresses. Even though we're relatively well compensated in STEM fields for performing PhDs, it's still incredibly stressful financially to be a graduate student. In particular, for normal in-person conferences, it can cost like $2,000 to attend a conference, and then you have to wait 2 to 3 months to be reimbursed by your university after you paid up front out of your own pocket. Sometimes that's really hard to do. And then the big one, there's the uncertainty about the future beyond academia, and especially I think this is relevant right now when the future of in-person academia itself is so uncertain. So like none of these create mental illness from thin air, but they can certainly make it worse. And these positive feedback loops exist between these things and a few other things that I want to talk about. These feedback loops exist not just for people who have been diagnosed with a mental illness, but they exist within people who may never be diagnosed with a mental illness, who may not be mentally ill, as well as people who experience particular sorts of mental illness. So within this talk, I want to offer technologies. I'm calling them technologies because words and thoughts are technologies to break some tangled cycles that I'm going to describe. And I claim that these technologies are unusually effective and not entirely obvious. At least they weren't for me originally. So I want to say these conditions, right? Accountability latency, difficult to know when you're allowed to stop working, financial stresses, uncertainty about the future. These are all, they all make worse and are made worse by executive dysfunction, by the broken narratives about laziness that we have in our culture, by what I'm calling imposter syndrome in scare quotes, and by a certain narrative of hopelessness for healing that I hope to heal itself. So let's dig into those, right? So some of you may have heard of the term executive dysfunction. It wasn't something that I was particularly familiar with until I started to dive into my own experiences of mental illness and try to understand from an analytic perspective what was going on. So when you look up executive dysfunction on Wikipedia, you find something like executive dysfunctions, collectively referred to as executive function and cognitive control, are a set of cognitive processes that are necessary for the cognitive control of behavior, selecting and successfully monitoring behaviors that facilitate the attainment of chosen goals. And like, this may be technically true, but I took the liberty of going into the edit content widget within Chrome and just reducing this to what I think sums up the essence of executive function. Executive function is the ability to just do the thing, whatever the thing is, when you really need to do the thing. And executive dysfunction is when you cannot just do something, even if you absolutely need to do it. And I know this is waffly, it's kind of a vague term, but I find it tremendously helpful because it puts a neutral word to the real struggle that almost all of us have sometimes, but especially people with particular kinds of mental illness like myself, to just do something when it feels like the whole world is screaming for you to do it, and somehow you just cannot make yourself perform the actions, as simple as they may seem to be. The reason I care about it so much as a neutral word is because it allows me to replace a word that I despise, and that word is lazy. So I gave a talk in 2018 entitled Keep Your Laziness in Check. It's about a random testing framework that I co-developed that's for checking whether certain functions in Haskell have the laziness properties that they should have. Haskell is a programming language that is called lazy because it only evaluates programs to the extent that they're necessary to be evaluated, rather than doing all the work it needs to do, even if you aren't going to see the result. But I think I also know a thing or two about the human kind of laziness, because this is what runs through my head all the time. Questions like, you knew what you had to do. You had enough time to do it. What's your excuse? People believe in your potential, so why are you letting them down? It's such an honor to be here, here being in whatever vaunted institution I happen to be in, UPenn, or like working at Galois, or like doing anything that I feel insecure about whether I'm supposed to actually be there. Why aren't you working harder to succeed? And of course, these are rhetorical questions, and of course the answer that I'm supposed to give myself, and which I very frequently do, is I must be incompetent and undeserving and ungrateful. In other words, I must be lazy. I don't think anyone is actually lazy. My bold claim is laziness does not exist, except in Haskell. If you want to do something and you don't, there's only a couple of different possibilities for what's really going on. One is you didn't actually want to do it. So you can observe perhaps when you want to do something, think to yourself, am I telling myself I should do something? And then if I replace it with I want to do something, does that still hold water? A lot of the time I do this exercise to myself. And I think if I say, well, I should work on this paper right now, but then I torment myself about why am I unable to work on this paper when I should be doing it. If I step back and say, I want to work on this paper right now, and I ask myself, does that actually feel true emotionally to me? If it doesn't feel true emotionally to me, then maybe I didn't actually want to be doing the thing, in which case I have a different set of problems, but it's not about my inability to do things I want to do. It's my inability to think about whether or not I actually want certain things. Or it's possible that I really wanted to do something, but something real stopped me from doing it, because if I wanted to do something and I had the opportunity to do it and I didn't do it, then clearly there was something that was standing in my way. And my bold and controversial claim is that your mind, all of your minds, are something as real as a wall or running out of time or anything like that, something that can stand in your way and be just as difficult an object as anything else. So I'm going to illustrate this by example. So if I'm wondering to myself, why couldn't I do some incredibly important task? And I say to some friend, I was very depressed and I couldn't get out of bed. This, by the way, happens to me quite frequently, even today. And if that friend said, it's all in your mind, I might almost be tempted to say, dang, well, you really sure are right about that. This is, of course, crap. Because imagine if instead I had the flu and I couldn't get out of bed, and that same friend said, well, it's all in your body. Why don't you just do the thing? It's just in your body. This is like some kind of linguistic type error. This doesn't make sense. So why does it make sense that it's all in your mind is an excuse to just wave away the difficulties that we have within our own heads? Because after all, the mind is a manifestation of the brain, and the brain is a part of the body. So I believe, and I want to convince you to believe, that both of these are equally real, but we have been taught otherwise by society. You'd be really ticked off if somebody said that it's all in your body, and so you ought to just work even though you're like incredibly sick. So I don't know, I'd be pretty ticked off if somebody said that it was all in my mind, so I ought to just be able to get things done even though I'm depressed or something like that. So you might have come across the Unix philosophy that a tool should do one thing well. And words are tools after all. I claim the word lazy would make a great Unix tool because it does one thing incredibly well. It shames. I use lazy in my internal narrative, and people, I think in general, use lazy in their external narratives to hurt and create shame. And the reason that they do that is because fear of shame is motivational. Anxiety and fear of being ashamed can sometimes be paralyzing, but often for people like me who really struggle with executive function, that adrenaline spike of like acute self-induced fear can crack through the surface of executive paralysis and make it possible to do the thing, but at great cost of harming my own psyche. And ultimately, I want to do what I love, not because I'm ashamed of what would happen if I don't, but because I love doing the thing. So I claim that letting go of the term lazy is some subset of letting go of the whole enterprise of the way shame functions to harm people within our culture. I think it's really hard. It's still a journey that I'm on, but I think it's incredibly worth it. And I encourage you to think about starting or continuing on that journey. So this talk has evolved a little bit since the last time I gave it. Lots of people who have never thought of themselves before as experiencing mental illness are experiencing it now, because the world is something else. The easiest narratives about mental illness, and some of the narratives that I've been talking about so far in this talk, which aren't wrong, speak of it as if it's individual and personal, something that's possibly hereditary, possibly caused by your individual environmental experiences as a child or as an adult. But it's also structural and societal just as much. Mental illness is a reaction to a world that also experiences and perpetrates harm. And today, perhaps more visibly than ever, there is immense suffering inherent in our societal structure. The pain in this world is just as real as the pain that I claim is just as real in your mind as it is in your body. The world is hurting. It's okay to hurt. I ask myself a lot, how do I do research amidst a global pandemic and the US government's negligent sacrifice of thousands and thousands of human lives to serve the financial interests of its wealthiest citizens, against the continual horrors of systematized state violence against Black people in the US, today in the forms of police brutality and deadly healthcare discrimination in a pandemic, against the rise of fascist governments around the world, the accelerating destruction of our biosphere accompanied by natural disasters and destruction and death. Like the list goes on and on, it goes through the bottom of the slide. I spent so much time trying to fit it and it just wouldn't fit on the slide. Like this stuff runs through my head and it paralyzes me. And I ask myself this question, and a lot of days I just don't know. I don't know how to do research. I don't know how to focus on the things that I'm supposed to be doing today. And I want to say that it is okay not to know. I want to sit there with that point for a moment because I think it's incredibly hard to internalize this sometimes. It's okay not to know how to do what you're supposed to be doing in a world that hurts like this. And it's okay to rest, because rest isn't laziness. There are so many reasons that all of us need rest right now, and it's not just rest from work. I want to affirm that resting is good. Some people say resting better means working harder, and it's true. Knowledge work, the kind of work that you'll be doing if you enter a PhD program, or that you are doing in a PhD program, is really nonlinear. It comes in fits and starts. It comes to you when you're in the shower or going for a run, and then just doesn't come when you're trying to push for it, sitting in front of your computer or your notebook. But I say that it's not just about how resting can promote your insights. I think it's also true, and equally, if not more importantly true, that your health and happiness are ends, not just means to your productivity. But Kenny, you say, doing nothing for a day, a week, a month, that sounds like laziness. And like somewhere in that progression, there, like you might have started to agree with me, but I think most of you probably at somewhere in that scale of a day through a month thought, that sounds like being lazy if I didn't get anything done a week or a month. Like I can keep extending the time scale until someone gets uncomfortable. It sounds like laziness. I want to really reaffirm. I want to like burn this into the brains of every person in the world that resting is not failing at work. Resting is succeeding at assuring your own health and happiness, which is the most important thing to you. It is the thing that you need in order to become a person who can do things in the world that matter to you, whether that's research, whether that's pursuing social justice, whether that is living your life however you think is most important to you. And I rest a lot. I get physically tired easily, especially in the typical office environment. And a lot of times I feel like I don't get enough done. And then of course come the laziness feelings, which means that I feel like I don't belong. So like needing rest, needing different working environments, it can make it feel like you're not supposed to be here, even more than just sort of the general like weirdness of being in a new place and the imposter syndrome that can conjure. Needing rest as a result of being mentally ill or physically ill or any other condition can make it feel like you're not allowed to be here, like you're making up for your deficiencies just to sort of survive by tooth and nail. But we've seen that more than 50% of us are struggling with stuff like this. It's just hard to see. And that's part of why I think it's important for me to be telling my personal story today, as opposed to just talking about facts and generalities. But it's still hard to know in your heart that you belong, even if you know in your head. So I want to claim that imposter syndrome, or what they call imposter syndrome, I claim it's not really a syndrome if everyone has it, is recursive, and it's hard to shake as a result. And I say it's recursive because, well, I think to myself, if I am an imposter and everyone says that they feel like an imposter, but everyone around me says that they feel like an imposter, and if you feel like an imposter, then you're in the right place after all, because people who feel like imposters are in the right place after all. Well, maybe surely I'm just sort of a next level up imposter where I feel like an imposter, but I'm the real imposter, and everyone else feels like an imposter, but they're actually supposed to belong. There's like this infinite regress there, at least for me. Maybe not for you. I hope not for you, actually. But in PL, we think about recursion all the time. And my claim is that imposter syndrome doesn't have a base case at all. You can just keep regressing to like these infinite levels of meta about like, am I an imposter because I think that I'm an imposter, but I shouldn't be feeling like, oh gosh. You can't think your way out by recursing, I claim. You have to step outside of the loop entirely. What does that mean? So like, institutional systems, universities, for instance, want prestige, so they create an image that most aren't worthy of being there. Selective admissions are a big deal, right? Which means that when we're in an institutional system, we don't voice our fears that our externally imposed trauma, our internal mental illness, our physical disabilities make us different, make us not belong, because that will make us seem like we don't belong, and we really want to belong. So we all feel like we're alone in our fears, but really we're all together and we don't need to fear at all. So just to sort of take a step towards that, I guarantee you that you are not the only one who has these fears and insecurities. And the more of us that talk about them out loud, the less power they have over us. So to get started, I want to go ahead and say, and I want to note before I say this, to be clear about how real imposter syndrome is for me, I was able to write this slide in about as long as it took me to read it out loud, just like free writing. I, Kenny Foner, am often scared that I'm a lazy fraud who's gotten by in academia and industry only because I have about one non-terrible idea about programming every year or so. But I'm certain this year I'm going to run out of ideas forever, and you'll all find out I've somehow tricked you into believing I'm smart because I like making puns about types and I enjoy like flashy slide design or whatever. I'm afraid I'm still here only because PL research is so full of kind people who think the best of everyone, even of someone as obviously insufficiently clever or dedicated as me. And this just rings true in my head. Like every time I read this slide out loud, I'm like, oof. But it's not true. So it's really not true. And it's true that it feels, it's like, oof, reading that out loud. But it's also, every time I read it out loud, it feels a little bit more fake. I want it to feel fake for everybody. And that's sort of what I'm getting to talking about hope. We talked about executive function, about narratives, about laziness, about imposter syndrome, about the world. I want to reframe healing from mental illness because I used to think I'm broken and I want to fix myself. But there's no cure for bipolar disorder that we know of, or anxiety or chronic depression. So it's unlikely I'm ever going to be cured. And I'm destined for sadness if I define success as fixing what's broken with me. It also means that thinking of myself as broken is the thing I need to do until some future that will probably never arrive. So now I don't hope for fixing what's broken about me. I hope to thrive with or despite my condition. And I hope to help fix the world so that we can all thrive, help repair the social systems that cause it to be so much more painful than it needs to be to exist as a person with mental illness in this world. So what is that hope even supposed to look like? I didn't know for a really long time because mental health is not monotonic. It's really easy to feel permanently despairing at every setback and permanently cured at every success. And these are both really illusory. Neither of them is true whenever you feel it. So hope can't be based on an instantaneous recovery or a permanent success. Sustainable hope means something like this, that when I'm suffering, I know I won't always be suffering. And when I'm happy, I know I won't always be happy. And always, I know that there will eventually be joy again. They say it takes a village to raise a child, and I say it takes a village to give a talk, especially a talk like this. In a normal technical talk, I'd use this slide to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators. And that's exactly what I'm doing in this not entirely typical PL talk. Thank you to all these people for mentoring me, for caring for me. I could not have given this talk without you. Thank you. And thank you for listening. I also want to take this moment, which would ordinarily be the thanks moment, to plug an event that's going to be happening right after the main ICFP conference called Shutdown PL, which is a space, it's a day of action, a space for sustained action against racism and systems of oppression within PL and beyond. We have a fantastic keynote speaker, Joy Melody Woods, who's going to be talking to us about resisting racism and structural oppression within technical communities and beyond. We have some amazing discussion tracks where we're going to be talking about ways that we can make really permanent change within our community today and going forward. So I really encourage you to attend. I think that it's relevant to the stuff that I've been talking about, and I also think that it's relevant to all of us. I want it to be. So please join me there, and thank you very much for your time.